Good afternoon, everybody, and you're all very welcome to this afternoon webinar. My name is Kevin O'Rourke. I'm a member of the Energy, Environment and Climate Action Committee of Engineers Ireland, and I suppose our remit in life is to explore and assess and debate the policy, technology and professional practice issues pertaining to the if you like, sustainability of energy as part of our society. And in that regard, we say that's very much our mission. And in the context of the urgent agenda regarding climate action in Ireland and in the world at the moment, district heating is one of the strategic lines of activity that are being explored, and with the intention to achieve some transformative change in the way in which we heat our buildings in the years ahead. So today's event is very much about its contribution to that exploration, and I hope you find it educational and productive. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to your chairman for the afternoon, Dara Connolly.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's Engineers Ireland webinar on realising the role of district heat in Ireland's road to net zero, jointly presented by ESB and SSE. I'm told we have a very good attendance today. A large number of people have registered to take part, and that's a very clear indication of the growing interest in district energy in Ireland. We have a very interesting lineup of speakers today and presentations, and I'll draw your attention to on the screen if you have any questions for the speakers during the course of the presentations, please submit them using the Q&A function on the right hand side of the screen, and we'll look to address as many questions as we can in the discussion panel at the end. So first of all, today it's my pleasure to introduce Donna Gartland, who's been a thought leader in district energy in Ireland over many years. She's the Chief Executive of Codema, which is Dublin's energy agency, and is also a founder director of the Irish District Energy Association, and is currently involved in the implementation of large-scale district heating schemes in Ireland. So I'd like to hand over now to Donna.
Thanks, Dara. That's great. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to the organisers for the invitation to be here today. It's great to see an event like this being organised, and great timing, I suppose, as well, just after the day after the launch of the Climate Action Plan 2021's Annex of Actions, where I suppose the devil is definitely in the detail of that plan. Firstly, yeah, great to see two IRDA members, so Irish District Energy Association members coming together to organise this, so SSE and ESB. So big thank you to you guys for this event. So I'll start off with, I suppose, just where we stand in Ireland in terms of heating, to give a bit of a background. So at the moment, 20% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland come from the heating sector. So quite a significant part, and that obviously includes, that's just like all greenhouse gas emissions, including agriculture. We're still 20% of that total pie chart is for heating. And when we look at within a European perspective, Ireland are currently last in Europe in terms of renewable heat. So we're down at 6.3% of our total heat demand from renewables. And when we look at, yeah, unfortunately that leaves us last in line when compared to our European peers. And when we look at those that are at the top of that leaderboard, so those that are kind of, I suppose, leading in the area of being able to integrate large amounts of renewables into their heating systems, it's those countries that also have large amounts of district heating networks. And I suppose it makes sense that instead of trying to change every single individual building onto renewables, it's much easier to integrate renewables onto a network. So in the same way that we have achieved high percentages of renewables in the electricity network by utilising, large-scale renewables like wind and connecting them onto the grid, the same idea is what we want to do in the district heating network. So once that network is in the ground, once that grid is in place, we can integrate multiple large-scale renewable heat sources. So the SEAI just launched their new Energy in Ireland report this morning. So again, another good timing for this particular webinar. And in there, it was interesting to see that the impacts of during COVID, and I suppose a kind of a more working from home hybrid kind of solution now that we will see probably stay into the future. The heating sector was actually the only sector to increase in its emissions. So the emissions for the heating sector have gone up by 2.6%, while transport and electricity have gone down. And that's due to mostly a big increase in residential energy demands, which increased by 8%. So now the heating sector in Ireland is now the largest energy sector in Ireland. So it requires more primary energy than transport or electricity at the moment. And our heat demands are set to increase further to 2030 due to economic growth. So we're looking at an increase to 2030 of about 14% of our heating requirements. So this is not obviously a sector that's going away, but has been largely ignored, I suppose, for a long time. And that's, I suppose, reflected in how badly we're doing at a national level in our targets. So when we started to look at district heating through the District Heating, the District Energy Association, one of the first things we did was try to build up that evidence base and to kind of overcome the knowledge gaps and I suppose some of the common myths around district heating in Ireland. And we commissioned this study in partnership with ESB, and looking at the heat demand density, the suitability of district heating in Ireland, and through that mapping the heat demands across the island. And we got, I suppose, European experts in this particular field to carry out that study for us back in 2019. And what that study showed was clearly that 57% of our heating demands are suitable for district heating. If we had the same supporting policies like they do in other countries, we'd be able to easily achieve that. And it's interesting that now the SEAI's own independent heat study that they're currently carrying out and will be published hopefully, well, it's supposed to be Q4 2021, so hopefully very soon. That study, the initial results of that have been presented by SEAI, and they show that 54%, their studies are showing 54% of the heat demand. So you can see that the two independent studies very closely correlate. So we have now a very robust evidence base to show that more than half of our heat demands in Ireland are suitable for district heating. So that's a great starting point, and I suppose that's what's led and I suppose brought more focus on the district energy sector in Ireland. So more recently then, through the association, we're part of a larger group called Renewable Energy Ireland. And in Renewable Energy Ireland, with some other members within the heat sector, we produced a heat study called 40 by 30. So what this found was that we can achieve 40%, like we wanted to call for a 40% target by 2030 for the heating sector. And that our study found that through our industry partners, that this was achievable by 2030 if certain policy measures were put in place by government. So one of the key findings of that study has shown that there are around 66 terawatt hours of renewable heat potential in Ireland. And that's looking at bioenergy, geothermal, waste heat, etc., all these different sources. And to put that in perspective, our total heat demand in 2030 is expected to be 51 terawatt hours. So we have more renewable heat potential in Ireland than we have heat demand. And so it's a strong indication that we can achieve very significant targets for renewable heat in Ireland. So we have 66 terawatt hours of renewable heat potential. Nearly half of that can only be used through district heating networks because they are sources such as waste heat or deep geothermal that aren't suitable on an individual building basis. So I suppose, in order to tap into a lot of that renewable heat potential, we need to have district heat networks. And all of the renewable heat potential can be utilised through district heating. So we can use bioenergy, we can use renewable electricity, we can use all different sources, obviously, through the network. So it's a real way for us, gateway for us to be able to achieve those targets. So based on the findings of that study, the District Energy Association set some key policy asks that were sent to the government during the formation of the Climate Action Plan. And we're happy to say that, a lot of these have been reflected in the final version of the Climate Action Plan. So one of them was to set a target of 10% of district heating, 10% district heating by 2030. And they have, in the new Climate Action Plan, set a target of 2.7 terawatt hours of district energy demand, which equates to approximately 10% of the heat in buildings to be supplied by district heating. So just another equivalent then, that's the same as 200,000 homes connected to district heating by 2030. So it's a significant increase on the target that was in the previous 2019 Climate Action Plan, which was less than 1 terawatt hour. So that's a great step forward for the sector. It shows that the government, I suppose, are taking this seriously, the sector seriously. We also asked that zoning be put in place, because that was one of the key things that allows, I suppose, district energy networks to grow in new markets. It's the zone so that we can future-proof the demands and future-proof the supplies in those areas to connect to a network when it goes in the ground. And again, in the new Climate Action Plan, there are promises in there to ensure that national, regional and local planning frameworks encourage and facilitate the development of district heating, and looking at facilitating zoning and suitable areas based on the outputs of that SEAI National Heat Study. So that's a great step forward, again, if we can integrate that into county development plans. So the actions around, it's great to see that specifically on district heating. So obviously there's lots of different actions on heating, but specifically district heating related actions, there's 14 actions on district heating. And if we compare that to previous action plans where there was, a handful of actions or less, or, it's not too long ago that there wasn't one action on district heating in a national document. So we have moved on significantly in the last 6 or 7 years. There's a big focus on phasing out of fossil fuels in general in the heating sector, which is obviously a big, there's huge potential then for district heating to come in and replace those fossil fuel solutions, particularly in public buildings. So there's a target that all public buildings after 2023 can only install renewable heat technologies, which obviously opens the door for a lot of these to connect to district heating networks. Some of the other kind of key actions, again, reflecting what some of the policy asks were from the Energy Association. They're going to designate a regulator for district heating by Q2 2022. There's going to be a steering group set up, which will send a report to government by the end of 2022, particularly looking at ownership models and the kind of, I suppose, a rollout kind of strategy for district heating. We also were lobbying for changes in the building regulations, specifically around the use of how waste heat is accounted for in the building regulations. So we're calling for a primary energy factor of 0 for waste heat. And in the Climate Action Plan Annex of Actions that was published yesterday, there is an action specifically on this to allow district heating to meet the renewable energy requirements, specifically that's mentioned in the Part L of the building regulations. And that has a target date of Q2 2022. So it's great to see that there's commitments and there's a timeline there for those changes, which will really open the doorway for connections to new developments. And they've also committed to a process for establishing primary energy factors for district heating schemes. So a clear process for district heating network operators to be able to establish their primary energy factors and get them verified. And again, that's promised by Q2 2022. They've also promised a clear kind of an outline of how ownership models will work for district heating by the end of next year, by the end of 2022. That's a key part of, I suppose, how district heating will be rolled out in Ireland, who will own what parts of the network and where those investments will go. I know that's something that will be hopefully will be discussed later on today, and be interesting to see what kind of questions from the audience on that particular area. And yeah, what the kind of private sector investment options are for district heating. So really, it's great to see the progress over the last so many years to get us to this stage. This Climate Action Plan is definitely the strongest climate action plan, the strongest national level indicator that we have that district heating is a key decarbonisation focus for the energy sector, and the government are committed to rolling this out, and we have a key target now for 2030. So there's lots of targets, there's lots of actions there that are to be delivered next year. So obviously it's going to be a very busy time for the sector in the next year. I presume there'll be lots of consultations, lots of steering groups, lots of different things that we'll all have to get together to feed into these and to make sure that from an industry perspective that our thoughts are reflected in those plans. So I will leave it at that. I think that gives us a bit of an oversight of, I suppose, where we are now at a national level, and it'd be very interesting to see now what, I suppose, the kind of best practice examples from other areas that we can try and replicate, and I suppose the good work of the likes of SSE and ESB in this particular area that we can hopefully bring into the Irish market very soon. I suppose, on a closing note, the best thing about developing district heating in Ireland is we're starting from scratch, which has its advantages. So we have a blank sheet, a blank canvas that we can start to integrate, I suppose, best practice district heating into Ireland. And that is an advantage we will have over other countries in Europe. So it's an exciting time for the industry, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentations today. So Dara, I'll pass back to you.
So thank you very much, Donna, for setting the scene. I think that there's tremendously good news in terms of the progress that's been made on a national level in terms of policy, and also for outlining the importance of regulation, planning and policy in issues like zoning. And that brings us on to our next presentation. So Guy Milligan is the lead in the Energy Strategy and Planning Service within Ramboll's Energy Division. And he will talk to us today about heat network zoning. So over to you, please, Guy.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you for the introduction there, Dara. And thanks, Donna. That was a really very comprehensive whistle-stop tour, and good to hear about the progress with district heating in Ireland. As Dara said, I work for Ramboll. I'm one of the associates in our district energy division in the Ramboll UK part of the business. We're a global organisation based out of Denmark. We're very much focused on engineering and sustainability consultancy. Thank you for inviting us to participate. It's an area of great interest to us, this subject matter, in terms of the broad need as well to focus on heat now. It is very much there, as Donna articulated. The 2020s is a very critical phase now if we're to continue on our pathway to net zero, and heat is very much now in terms of a focus sector of energy. Next slide, please. Controlling the slides. Thank you. So the agenda in the next 10-15 minutes, I will introduce the topic of heat network zoning. Then for the nations of England and Scotland, I'll look at the emerging policy and regulatory landscape that is coming into the market. We'll look at the emerging approaches that the two respective nations are taking towards developing zoning for heat networks. We'll look at what's happening next on the more immediate horizon, and then I'll wrap up with some conclusions. Next slide, please. So very briefly, what do we mean by heat network zoning? It's about energy planning. It's about energy planning specifically for heat networks in this case. So we need to consider that a heat network is it's a long-term investment in energy infrastructure. It has the potential to cover very significant geographical areas, and by virtue of that, there are many and multiple stakeholders involved in both the planning and the delivery of district energy or heat networks specifically. So when I talk about heat networks, we shouldn't overlook the fact that there may be opportunities for cooling networks as well to be developed alongside that. So the importance here is that because of the long-term nature of these infrastructural assets, they should be and need to be planned strategically. We're talking 50, 60, 70 euro investment projects here. The zones themselves are focusing on trying to identify where heat networks could be the optimal technology choice within a particular geographical area. So recognizing that there are multiple potential solutions to decarbonize heating, of which district heating is one, but by no means the only technical solution. The typical approach, which we'll come on to shortly, is to be very much demand-led. So we're looking at areas where there is a high level of density of energy demand, of heat demand. But critically and importantly, as we move into the net zero future, we need to look at where there is availability of low carbon heat sources, of which Donna was referring to several in her presentation. Once we've got to a point where we have an identifiable zone, then we can start to plan around delivery. So we can look at what the impact and the implications are of the designation of a zone for a heat network. We need to understand how we transition to the heat network as the sort of optimal source of heat within that area. So we need to look at how we unlock that, and that does involve policy. That does require, in the current marketplace, that does require support in terms of funding, and it requires policy and intervention from national and local governments. The picture on the right is an example of some zoning that we've done relatively recently in a US city, in Cambridge. Next slide, please. So starting firstly, looking at Scotland. So the map on the right of this slide is taken from some very recent research by BEIS, the UK Government Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So that looked at the opportunity for district heating in the UK. So obviously we're looking initially here at Scotland, and the red clustered areas there are centred around the major cities in Scotland, which really feeds into what I mentioned around high levels of heat demand density. The coverage, it's actually quite a bit less than the recent Irish study, but significant nevertheless, looking at nearly 30% of heat demands could in theory be supplied from district heating. Scottish Government has acknowledged this and has been supporting district heating schemes over the last 10 years. So we're talking about what some might refer to as islanded networks, discrete networks. Because of that, district heating hasn't really taken off anywhere near the levels of 28% as shown on the slide. We're actually stuck rather stubbornly at a level of about 2% of heat from district heating in the UK right now. So there's an order of magnitude of change here to get to those sort of levels, which isn't obviously going to happen overnight. And part of the reason for now for focusing on policy is that governments have recognised that there are some fundamental structural challenges that need to be dealt with, and the feeling is that the market can't deal with those on their own. So there's a need for intervention to address those through policy and regulatory change. Next slide, please. So this is a summary snapshot of some of the key policy areas and affecting district heat and heat zoning. So overarching is the Climate Change Act, which was revised in 2019 to deliver net zero in Scotland by 2045. So a very ambitious target, some might say. Others might say that's not ambitious enough. The Heat Networks Act was legislated just this year. And that's a really interesting piece of legislation. And some of the key elements of that involve licensing of heat network operators. So the intention is to drive up standards and improve customer confidence in district heating, bearing in mind that it's a not well-established technical solution in the UK still. It will provide certain rights to the operators of networks, so similar to what traditional statutory undertakings might already be used to and require to perform effectively. Importantly, it will place duties on local authorities to review their regions in terms of the opportunity for district heating, and will give them the power to designate an area within their region as a heat network zone. And then lastly, there would be a permitting system. So it would provide the license operator with a permit, effectively an exclusivity to own and operate and develop a network within the zone. Last month, the Scottish Government published a consultation on the Heat Networks Delivery Plan, which is in essence a methodology to deliver the intentions of that Act. We've actually just been commissioned by Scottish Government to do an analysis of the consultation responses on that. And then on the right-hand side, the heat and building strategy, also published this year by the Scottish Government. A couple of things to draw your attention to in that are LHEs, local heat and energy efficiency strategies. So this very much is part of the identification and designation of zones at a local authority level. The Scottish Government's been piloting that with all 32 of the Scottish local authorities since 2017. And there was a draft methodology that was produced earlier this year. We conducted a peer review of that methodology, and there have subsequently been some changes and refinement to that methodology, and that continues to be evolved into 2022, with the intention that from 2023 there will be a statutory duty for local authorities to identify and designate heat network zones within their local authority areas. Lastly, in recognising that this isn't going to happen without ongoing support from government, there will be that support available. There will be funding. So the Scottish Government has had a capital funding scheme running for a number of years now called the Low Carbon Infrastructure Transition Programme, bit of a mouthful. It also has something called the District Heating Loan Fund. Both those schemes will continue. Also importantly, there'll be capacity support through a heat network pre-capital support unit, and that's going to provide supporting services, legal, financial, technical and commercial to the delivery partners, i.e. the local authorities. And then lastly, a part of that there'll be a prospectus that the Scottish Government will produce, which will sort of reinforce the opportunity areas to help the market, I suppose, understand the opportunity in the market to mobilise and position itself to support the evolution of district heating in Scotland. If you just do 3 clicks, and I'll just bring up 3 boxes on the screen. 1, 2, 3, there they are. I'm not going to talk through them, but you can see on the left of the targets, Donna mentioned 200,000 homes by 2030. Scottish Government's targeting 650,000 homes by 2030 to be connected by district heating, fundamentally to support the decarbonisation of heating, which, as is the case also in Scotland, 20% of emissions are attributable to heat, so it's a big contributor. And similar to the Irish case, the UK is really no better in terms of renewable heat. Currently, it's still hovering around 6.5–7%, so we're competing at the bottom of the table there. And the bottom right-hand grey box there shows the level of investment just in this parliamentary session, which is 1.8 billion to be supporting the growth of heat networks. Next slide, please. So just in terms of an emerging approach, the Scottish Government's looking to achieve, I suppose, 2 fundamental things. One is to ensure that there is, incentive for investors to come and participate. So it's not just about public sector; it's also very much about private sector capital, private sector entrepreneurship and initiative. But also, they need to be affordable to consumers' networks. So there needs to be some level of regulation. Is the implication of that to ensure that customers are getting a fair deal. 4 elements: data collection, actually quite a big challenge, as any of the engineers will appreciate, getting good data, accurate, reliable data, particularly from the private sector. But that's there's a lot of focus on trying to achieve that right now. Opportunity identification led by what's called a linear heat density, I suppose, as a proxy in terms of where heat networks might be viable. Then moving into opportunity prioritization, so that's looking at not just that initial proxy, but also looking at more specifically about financial, technical, and other considerations like fuel poverty, brownfield investment regeneration, and so on and so forth. So there'll be contributing considerations towards prioritization of network opportunities and therefore zones. And then lastly, moving into more sort of recognizable analysis of specific opportunities through techno-economic evaluation. Next slide, please. Lastly, and quickly, there will be more consultation around this. It's an emerging area. The top box is really emphasizing a couple of key challenges still, is that how do you gain the surety of demand? So colleagues in SSE will appreciate this. There needs to be that certainty around customer connection and revenues from heat sales, of course. But also there needs to be the availability of heat supply. So how do you guarantee that? How do you ensure that the in quotes owners of surplus or waste heat are actually making that heat available to the district heating suppliers? Methodology continues to evolve. There'll be more guidance on that off the back of the heat networks delivery plan consultation mentioned earlier on. And of course, as I mentioned, the LHES methodology, which continues to be tested through 2022. And lastly, just a couple of points around challenges. Devolution has brought a lot of powers to the devolved nations, but there are still constraints, particularly in the energy sector. The gas and electricity networks are not devolved. They're still controlled at a UK government level. And also, there's a big impact of this scale of change here in terms of skills, resources, capacity to deliver. Local authorities as the change agents, many of them are stretched, many of them don't have significant resources, and they need support. Next slide, please. I'm conscious I'm running on a bit, so please speed me up if I'm taking too long. In terms of the English,
I'd say five minutes, guys. So you probably have time to finish out your presentation.
Sure, thank you, Dara. I'll accelerate. The English position is slightly less in terms of the opportunity of percentage cover, but it's far bigger in terms of the potential heat supply from district heating. Actually, notably, a lot of the heat supply from district heating in the UK is in England, more than 90% of it, and a big amount of that is in London. About 25% of the district heating supply is currently in London. Next slide, please. There's a consultation being published by UK government on heat network zoning. It was published in November. The context of this is worth mentioning. We, along with other consultants, have been working with BEIS over the last 2 years now on looking at city-scale heat decarbonisation, of which district heating is an element. And out of that work came the concept which we introduced around the value of zoning, the importance of zoning. So consequently, in parallel to this ongoing work, the methodology zoning approach has been developed through the course of this year, and that led to the consultation. England is looking at where zones can provide the lowest cost, low carbon solution, as you can see in the box there. I've highlighted 3 key aspects to the consultation. One is about to what extent can consumers be mandated to connect. Second is about emphasising that this is now about low carbon heat, so we're moving away from the traditional gas CHP led district heating systems which are prevalent across the UK right now. And the third point is about it's having a robust and standardised methodology. Next slide, please. Again, just quickly, methodology starts at a national level, identifying areas of opportunity, government led, moving into local. So this local is about refinement, it's about designation, it's about engagement with local stakeholders, and it's ultimately about delivery. And the second element is about the feasibility. So having designated the zones, it's about identifying specific networks within those zones, how they might connect up in time within and across zones, and then moving forward into a delivery pathway through procurement. So in the UK, in England rather, there is a funding mechanism to support that. There's the Heat Networks Investment Project, which has been ongoing, and that's now being superseded by what's called the Green Heat Networks Fund. So that's a capital-based support fund, hundreds of millions of pounds in there to support network development. Next slide, please. Nearly finished, Dara. There will be a pilot now, which Ramboll's bid into to support the zoning pilots, which BEIS intends to roll out to 30 towns and cities, as you can see on the slide there. It's part of developing the evidence base around the methodology for zoning. That will start in Q1 and run for about 8 months. In parallel, the government will be looking at how to protect consumers, how to deliver regulation to ensure that consumers get a fair deal. And some challenges. Well, there continues to be a disparity between the business as usual gas boilers versus the currently still more expensive low carbon solution alternatives. There's the issue around demand assurance. How far can government go in terms of mandating connection? There's the issue about low carbon heat supply and its availability, which is obviously critical to deliver these heat networks. And then lastly, well, what happens if a zone is designated? How do consumers respond whilst there's that sort of limbo period, if you like, between when the network's available to connect and when potentially a consumer needs to replace their existing heating system? Next slide, please. And lastly, quickly conclusions. So both governments are looking at a standardization of methodology, as hopefully I've been able to show you. Local authorities are critical to both refine and to coordinate delivery of these zones. There will need to be new powers provided to local authorities to enable that to happen and to address the demand risk, which I've mentioned a number of times. And lastly, by looking only at district heating, we can't only look at district heating. Sorry, we need to look at the whole energy system and the implications of, I suppose, the counter to what if a building isn't in a heat network zone? How do you deliver that heat? You know, what impact might that have on the DNO, the power distribution network operator? You know, is the capacity there to support other solutions where district heating isn't available, and vice versa, where district heating is targeted? Then, you know, by working with the DNO, then targeted investment can be made in the right places. So ultimately, you end up with optimal solutions at scale across the whole region. That's my slide. Dara, I'm sorry I ran on slightly over there, but I hope that was of interest.
That's very interesting indeed. So thank you very much, Guy. So I suppose one thing that's highlighted there is the critical role of local authorities in enabling district heating in their area, as well as in concert with national policy frameworks, which includes money, but not just money. So that's probably universal across Ireland as well as England and Scotland. So thank you very much for that. Next, I would like to introduce Fiachra McGinley, who's a project director in ESB Smart Energy Services, delivering large-scale complex heating solutions for large energy users. Fiachra's presentation will give a fascinating insight into the potential for recovering heat from wastewater treatment plants, which is important because it's a resource that exists in every town and city in Ireland. So Fiachra, go ahead, please. Thanks, Dara. Just double checking, you can hear me all right there, Dara, yeah? Okay, yeah. So firstly, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank SSE, Engineers Ireland, and ESB for taking the opportunity to give an overview presentation on the project which I've recently been recently have actually delivered there. Project started around about 2019, contracts were signed. Just something that struck me there based on Donna's presentation and Guy's, which was the requirement for government funding and government support. The project that we've actually delivered here was actually heavily supported by the UK government via a grant called the
RHI grant. So I think that's an important thing to know. It kind of echoes what yourselves are saying there. So without further ado there, I'll go into my first slide here. So when looking at district heating and renewable energy, traditionally I think that both industries have been looked at in isolation to one another, but when you look at the actual drivers behind each one, they're actually quite very similar. So they are. So when you look at district heating and cooling drivers on the left hand side here, you can see almost the exact same here on the right hand side. So climatic and environmental conditions, population density, economic factors, improving economics, and the results effectively as to where you actually get to, next slide please there, is ultimately it's the same area. So I'm going to sort of try and tie in with some of what we've been able to actually tackle here on the greenhouse project in the UK here. So where you get to the result of the drivers from district heating and cooling and renewable energy would be, for instance, the reduction of CO2 emissions. On the greenhouse job that we've delivered, we can provide up to 100% of the CO2 emissions for use within the greenhouse itself from the combined heat and power plant. The decrease of primary energy supply and the increase of proliferation of renewable energy, we can actually provide up to 90% of the heating thermal demand within the greenhouse from a renewable source. The decrease of annual costs of energy, quite a few of greenhouses within the UK and the Netherlands have actually delayed their planting season due to the rising costs of energy, primarily on natural gas. Okay, and I think all of these ultimately kind of sings the same tune, which is carbon neutrality by 2050. So on the next slide here, I'll go into the case study itself. I'll do an introduction, an overview of the project. Okay, so SES were basically contracted to deliver Great Britain's largest renewable electric heating project. Okay, and ultimately what that meant was to deliver heat from a renewable source in the region of 30 hectares. Now that's approximately in the region of about 70 acres. Okay, the project on the top on the left hand side here is actually taken by myself on the greenhouse on the first week of planting. It was around about the 22nd, 23rd of January 2021. Okay, now you'll hear me talking about the scale and the size of it. It really is quite breathtaking when you see some of the photos later on here on the sheer size and scale of it. Okay, it's an investor-owned project in Norwich and Bury. It's located in and around an hour north of London Stansted Airport on the east of England. Okay, so next slide, please. So just to give you an overview on the main plant that we installed. So site 1 is the site at Crown Point, Norwich. Okay, that's just over a 16-hectare glasshouse, whereby there's an Anglian water treated final effluent, which is in the region of 2 kilometers away. Okay, we have 16 2.1 megawatt heat pumps. Apologies, there's an actual typo on the screen here. I'm just after seeing it here, where it says kilowatt thermal demand and kilowatt electrical. That's actually megawatts. Okay. The CHPs have been sized to accommodate the electrical load on site. Okay, so we have 3 1.2 megawatt CHP units, and we also have gas boilers in the event of a power outage. There's also an emergency diesel generator there to supply heat in the event of a power outage, or to give the HT thermal storage there a bump in temperature on what the requirements are. On the second site in Bury St Edmunds, it's largely similar, just slightly smaller. Okay, it is 1 glass house as opposed to 2 smaller glass houses. It's just shy of 13 hectares. Okay, it's the exact same principle. It's almost the exact same project, just slightly smaller. We have 13 2.1 megawatt heat pumps, 1 CHP less, and 2 gas boilers, which are just slightly smaller in capacity, which is in the region of around about 6.5 megawatts each. Okay, next slide, please. So coming into the greenhouse energy concept, so if I just start at the bottom of the slide here, basically on the Anglian water site, there is a final effluent discharge, and right at the last leg, if you like, of that final effluent discharge, we effectively tap into that final effluent discharge, and we run that final effluent, which is temperatures anywhere from 10 to 25 degrees, into what we call an abstraction chamber. From that extraction chamber, there is a series of submersible pumps that's located internally in the abstraction chamber. We then pump that from the submersible pumps through heat exchangers and directly back out then to the river, which is in the region of around about 3 degrees or above. Okay, on the opposite side of that heat exchanger, there is the heat transfer fluid line. So the sewage heat recovery site to the energy centre is the 2 to 2.5 kilometre range there, which I previously mentioned. So that takes it up to, so that's a continuous closed loop coming from the opposite side, which is actually an open loop, okay? So the heat pumps take that temperature range from between 10 and 25 degrees, and they upgrade that heat by the refrigeration process on site to a usable upgraded heat in the region of between 35 to 55 degrees, okay? That is sent into the low temperature thermal energy storage buffer vessel, which is then utilized and circulated throughout the greenhouse itself. Okay. Now the electrical demand on site is actually utilized from the CHP unit that's actually running on site itself. So there's actually, when there is high thermal demand, there's actually little energy or electricity which we're taking off the grid. So the CHP can has three benefits really. It has the opportunity to generate up to 3.6 megawatts on site of electrical capacity. It also has the opportunity to deliver up to 3.6 megawatts in thermal capacity. So the LT temperature storage tanks are sitting sweetly at, let's say, between 50 to 55 degrees. Should there be a requirement for any temperatures above this range, up to anything up to between 70 and 80 degrees, that can actually be provided from the combined heat and power units itself. Okay, in the event that there is economic benefits for the end user, we can, and there's a low thermal demand on site there, we can actually utilize the CHP to actually export to the grid as well. Okay, as well as that, the combined heat and power, as I just previously mentioned there, we can actually utilize the CO2 from the combined heat and power process for use within the greenhouse as well. So it sort of has three main benefits that that is utilized in a combined approach as such for the end user. As I said there, the backup boiler there can be used in the event of a power outage, or in the event that there is in the depths of winter, let's say when there's freezing conditions, you know, you have up to 15 megawatts there sort of on demand really, like that you can tap in straight away. So moving into the next slide there. So starting at the bottom of the previous slide there, this is just some photos taken from site here. So on the left hand side here is the abstraction chamber on site. Okay, so this is where the final effluent actually comes in to a submersible pit here, and our submersible pumps are actually internal in there. To the right of that photo there, you can actually see where the pipework is heading into the heat exchange building which is located on the right hand side here. Okay, the heat exchangers there are just at the back of that photo. To the front of that photo there, you can actually see the main circulation pumps, whereby the circulation pumps pump the main header pipework just to directly behind where the photographer is taken, and that actually pumps it up to, I'll just go to the next slide there, up to the energy center, which is here on your screen here now. So the energy center can be seen on the left hand side here. Okay, you can see some pictures of cars and some trucks there that's taken in some CO2. On the photo here, you can see the two large huge tanks here. On the left hand side is the HT tank that's sized for in the region of around about 400,000 litres. The one on the right is the LT tank that's actually around about 300,000 litres. You can see the exhausts from the two boilers, and the three CHPs, and also the three main ducts there are the air intake and air discharge for the combined heat and power process. On the front of that photo here, just on the front, see if I can just No, it's not letting me do it. Sorry. Okay, so on the front of the photo here is the dry air coolers, which would be utilised to reject heat to the atmosphere in the event that the electrical requirements are necessary to run the CHP and there's not an actual HT thermal demand. There's to the top left of that photo there, you can see a large CO2 tank, whereby there's a truck actually just after finishing delivery when the photograph was taken, whereby liquid CO2 would be delivered to the site in that tank, and we can actually send hot water into a CO2 vaporizer, which would vaporize the liquid CO2 into vapor form for utilization again for internally within the greenhouse. On the right hand side here, you can see the 16 heat pumps lined up in a row there. That is the pipe work for the refrigerant intake and discharge from the system itself, or sorry, from the heat transfer fluid line. Coming into the next slide here. So this is just some additional photographs here from actually on site here. So the photograph on the left hand side is actually the Bury site. The previous one was actually the Norwood site, but the two of them are actually identical. Our installers actually done a fantastic job there, in fairness to them. The photo in the middle is the backup boilers. It's quite significant in capacity and size. On the right hand side here is the CHP installed. I suppose it doesn't really give it justice there on the capacity. That's pretty much the same size as almost like a 40-foot container. It comes just as a sealed unit itself, so it does. So coming on to the next slide here. So this is an aerial shot of the greenhouse at our Norwood site. So the greenhouse that you can see evidently there is one of two across the site on the Crown Point Norwood site. So that one that you can see there is in the region of around about 8 to 8.5 hectares there. The energy centre is that small building on the left hand side here, which I just showed you is a blown up shot of. Those packing houses are basically supplying on the Crown Point Norwood site. It's predominantly peppers. So the Crown Point Norwood site supply up to around about 13% of the UK's requirements, and on the Bury site, it's they can supply up to 10% of the UK's tomatoes requirements, which is the equivalent of in the region of 10 tonne a day, between 10 and 20 tonne a day that those pack houses can actually take out from site there. So we've just finished the planting season by 2021, and we're just preparing for the planting season in 2022. I suppose the main message, I suppose, that I would like everyone to take out of this presentation is that this project gives an overview as to how combining several different sources of energy can provide a solution, but the end user doesn't necessarily have to be a greenhouse. It can be a block of flats. It can be potentially a cities as a whole. Like the equivalent of the thermal demand that we're supplying is the equivalent of supplying up to potentially 20,000 homes in the capacity that we have that we've delivered there. So moving into the next slide. So this slide sort of ties back into where I was discussing around district heating and cooling drivers and renewable energy. That really, looking at that as a whole, sort of in a way echoes what Donna had previously said there, whereas we kind look at that as really district energy as such. And I think the greenhouse project is a prime example of that, where we combine several technologies to the end user. For instance, you can see on the screen here that there was CHP and CO2 that we supplied there. There was heat pump technology there. There are actually ground loops sourced there. For a heat pump technology to work efficiently, the heat source can become in many forms. So, for instance, we were supposed to have actually in the original design, we were actually going to incorporate some ground loop boreholes in that as well. I mean, for heat pumps to work efficiently, the heat source can come in many forms. It just so happens that we were it was a world first with extracting heat from the final effluent, but I mean, it can come in the form of from ground, from air, from rivers, from final effluent, which is what we've actually proven now. Just some of the other points there that we've dealt with in the project is energy monitoring. For instance, I can log into the system now today via a VPN and a web portal I can actually check the discharge temperatures, the flow rates, how the system is operating now. Is it efficient? Is it operating sufficiently as it should be? What's the COP of the heat pumps? I mean, we've recently delivered on a solar project on source pavilions. Energy storage, hydrogen can be a part of that district energy solution. I suppose each and every option is diverse in itself, but I think tying that into district energy as opposed to just district heating and cooling, I think is a great opportunity to deploy several technologies in a combined effort. So I think that is it. I think if there's any questions after, I'd be glad to take any on the project itself. Thanks, Dara.
Well, thank you, Fiachra, for bringing us through that exciting and innovative project. So I think one of the important points you touched on there is that district energy is essentially, in terms of the heat source, it's technology agnostic, and we can introduce heat from all sorts of renewable sources. So finally, our final speaker today is Jody Pidway, and Jody is Sector Director for SSE Heat Networks, working with public and private sector clients to deliver partnerships for the delivery and operation of heat networks, and is also involved in the emerging market framework for heat networks regulation. So over to you, Jody.
Thanks, Dara. Can you hear me okay? Great stuff. Thanks. Hi. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And yeah, thanks to all the organisers for the opportunity to speak today. It's great to hear, an example there of a project that's looking at multiple sources of heat and the great role that heat networks can play in transporting what would previously been wasted heat to users. So that, yeah, fantastic, really interesting. I'm just going to talk today about a few reflections really on our time and experience in the UK heat market. And hopefully some of that will be useful in terms of where Ireland is in its journey towards district heat. So I've personally been involved in the heat networks business for about 10 years now, looking after our heat network sector, and our business has been in the UK for a bit more than that, 11 or 12 years now. So just quickly, just touching on what I'll go through today. Very quickly touch on group and Ireland. We'll be talking a little bit about our networks and our lessons learned in those networks. Some of the policy areas, which mirrors some of the areas that Guy was talking about earlier on, where I think we've got lots of supporting areas and some areas we need to look at which are creating challenges. And then finally, some thoughts on how the private and public sector can work together developing these projects. So very quickly on SSE, there's a snapshot of SSE in Ireland. As a group, we're looking to invest about £12.5 billion over the next 5 years in low carbon infrastructure. So we're all about investing, building, owning and operating primarily electricity infrastructure, but also other low carbon infrastructure, and clearly heat networks are a really good fit with that as we move away from gas-fired systems into, as we've heard about today, multiple sources of renewable and waste heat transmission. So that's the business in Ireland. Yeah, next slide, please. In terms of in the UK, we have, next slide, please. We've got a large number of networks. They're predominantly in London, as Guy's touched on. There's been a pretty supportive planning policy in London, which has driven heat networks deployment. It's tended to be quite small scale island type networks that are perhaps limited by contracts and plant size. And so you've got this sort of patchwork of small, some expanding, but generally fairly small scale networks, which are beginning to start to interconnect with a bit more sort of strategic planning there. But it's an interesting example of one way to approach a planning for these networks, and the results that you get in terms of sort of scale of the networks you get there, quite different to the sorts of city scale planning that we've heard about earlier on in the session today. I think other themes to bring out of this is that, you know, SSE is responsible from cradle to grave on these projects. So we get to see at each stage of the project, through the feasibility, the design, delivery, commissioning and operation, where things go well and where things don't go so well. We've invested in these networks, so we've got financial drivers to make sure that they are running as efficiently as possible, and we've got reputational risks. So we are absolutely incentivized to make sure we're looking after the customers that are connected onto these networks, and that we're working at the start of the process to keep tariffs as low as possible. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a later slide. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on an example of a project we're developing at the moment. Hopefully I can come back in a year or two's time and show you some impressive images of the site itself and the development work. But at this stage, we're at development stage. But I bring this one up because I think it's an interesting example at one end of the ownership model spectrum in terms of how schemes can be deployed. So this is a project in Leeds. People who are familiar with Leeds may well be aware of Leeds Pipes, which is the local authority owned and operated network, which you can see up there in the top left-hand side of the screen, of the image on the left. That's a city centre scheme fed from a Veolia energy from waste plant, which has been expanding over the last few years. As I say, led by Leeds. And what we're doing is there down to the sort of west of the city, there's going to be another new energy from waste plant being built. So we are working with the owner operator of that waste plant in collaboration with Leeds, who've effectively providing an enabling role. So they are effectively designating as not a zone, not in the formal way that Guy has described, but effectively an area in which we will work with their blessing and support to engage with potential off-takers for a new heat network. And where we started is with the all-important anchor load. These schemes need that core anchor load generally to get the business case away and get that initial investment made, which will be this Yorkshire Water wastewater treatment plant that you can see there in the right-hand image, very close to where the EFW is going to be located, and a large, stable base load for that network to supply. So that creates the embryo for the scheme effectively, and the aim is then to develop and expand and roll that out in towards the city, and hopefully at some point connect into the Leeds Pipe network. I'm probably touching on a point that Donna was making earlier on. It then gives you this opportunity to have obviously multiple off-takers, but multiple sources of heat coming into that network over time, which takes you into all sorts of interesting areas in terms of ownership models. So just a good example of a very different type of project we're involved with, very different to the concession type schemes that we've got in London, for example. So next slide, please. So I mentioned, in terms of lessons learned, and certainly the UK lags behind lots of European countries in terms of scale of district heating deployment and years that district heating has been a core technology. But in terms of what we've learned in the UK, I think and hope a lot of this will be relevant to Ireland's journey in terms of deploying these networks. And I've put design top there. And what we see in the networks that we have predominantly adopted is a large range of designs, lots of different contractors, and effectively you baking in a huge amount of system performance for the long term with that design. So getting that right from the start is so important. And we've seen, in recent years, the development of standards. I think generally the standard of design with the likes of Ramboll that I should mention, bringing in that European expertise is definitely improving. But it's so critical. And just to pull out some practical examples, enabling plants to be easily maintained, easily replaced, for you to be able to bring in contingency plans. If the worst does happen, you need to bring in temporary plant. Ease of connection of those things, very practical things, that you don't always get if you don't have the long-term perspective on a network. So what we bring to the design process is that understanding of the operational phase of a project and what you need from that design to make it as safe and simple and cost effective to run. So that's really, really key. Time spent at the outset on your design is fundamental. The second point there is really around stakeholders, and we've touched on this on some of the previous speakers' presentations. Citywide schemes in particular will have multiple stakeholders with different drivers potentially for the outcome of that scheme, and it's really, really important to understand who those stakeholders are, clearly, and what their drivers are from the start, and not to underestimate that there may be conflicting drivers within organisations, within local authorities, in terms of the aims and objectives for a given scheme. So time spent and effort spent helping the client and various stakeholders to understand what the risk profile of the projects looks like, what you may or may not want to control, to help those stakeholders understand where they want to be in the long-term operation and running of the scheme, we think is really, really important. And understanding and making sure that the decision makers that are bought into that process from the start and are clear on it is really, really key. And then the third one, back to design again, but this time from the perspective of customers. And what we strongly recommend is that you would run your techno-economic model, so your model that links the engineering design and the energy inputs and outputs with your cost base, your operating costs, your running costs, your end user tariffs. And what that does, it enables you to look at changes in design as you go through a process, and what that might mean in terms of the operating and repair costs on a network, the system efficiency, and directly then what that means for end user tariffs as you go through the process. So that's really, really fundamental, and strongly recommend that. Next slide, please. So just some reflections on policy, and appreciate Guy's obviously been into some good detail there in terms of zoning, which is going to be a crucial part. We can see that as part of the design of the policy work in Ireland. It's part of what's happening in the UK as well. But just to set out what I think are some key drivers really for the sector in the UK, we've got top level ambition and drivers, and a view of where we can realistically get in terms of heat deployment. This 2 to 20% crudely, we've talked about across the UK, potentially 20% of heat can be met viably from heat networks. We're around, as Guy said earlier, about 2% at the moment. So absolutely a couple of orders of magnitude difference in terms of the scale where we can feasibly and realistically get to. We're starting to see the primary legislation coming through, secondary not too far behind, we hope, and we've got local planning in some areas which is very supportive of heat networks already, but it is isolated and doesn't necessarily work everywhere. And we have grant funding through capital funding, feasibility works funding, commercialisation funding coming into the sector as well. And the bottom two there as well. It's not everywhere. Not everyone has to sign up to it, but we do have a customer protection scheme for heat customers, which does give customers access to an ombudsman, and has started to set a standard, I suppose, a more widely understood standard of what customer service, customer standards should look like across the sector. And also the emergence of technical standards as well. I think just to pick out two, conscious of time, two of the key barriers, I think would be that we are still, and obviously things have changed quite dramatically in the last 6 months, but we are still in a world where gas is relatively cheap, gas connections are relatively cheap, and there generally aren't drivers on customers to decarbonise their existing buildings. Clearly there are exceptions to that. But generally within areas, you're up against a cheap counterfactual and a lack of cohesive drivers, I suppose, on owners of buildings to change their heat source, which makes heat network deployment at the current moment in time quite challenging in the UK. I mentioned at the top there, Heat Networks Industry Council, very briefly. That's an initiative between industry and government. So working quite closely with BEIS to effectively help to get policy where we think it needs to be to really unlock all of these, the growth that we're needing, and bring the industry perspective on what that policy needs to look like, and backing that up with commitments around investment and jobs and carbon reductions. Next slide, please. And in terms of the future here, we've talked already about zoning. Agree, I think that's absolutely fundamental. I think we're starting to see the roadmap towards the end of natural gas, in terms of new properties, and UK government starting to talk about ambition for there being no replacement of gas boilers possible from the mid-2030s. Those two things are going to be, I think, fundamental. They start to create that sort of that roadmap and that journey. A bit like announcements around petrol and diesel vehicles, it starts to get people thinking about where they need to be in 5, 10, 15 years time, which is fundamental. And on the right hand side there, what will remain, as we've touched on in other sessions here, is the skills gap that we have in the UK, and the need to train and develop right across the project development life cycle in terms of skills. That challenge for local authorities is sort of front and centre in terms of strategically planning and deploying these networks. Is going to be challenging, I'm sure, and we'll need help in terms of expertise and capacity, and ensuring we can do this affordably. And that's where I think heat networks have got a key role to play, because to my mind, they're going to give us the best potential to provide affordable heat for people in the right areas, and keeping things as close as possible to where we are currently with gas costs. Perhaps not currently, but where we've been historically with gas costs. Next slide, please. So the last area to touch on quickly is to just, I guess, have a little look at some of the complementary, as we see them, drivers, objectives, capacity, powers, effectively, that sit with the public sector and the private sector. And we've run quite a few workshops with various local authorities in the UK, and kind of walked through the development, deployment, operation of a heat network system, and walk through sort of appetites for risk and control as we've gone through that, to understand where they sit. And generally, I would say the conclusion has been that a public-private partnership in some shape or form, potentially a JV, is very attractive, and it brings together what we think a pretty complementary set of skills here. At one end of the spectrum, you have got the Leeds example that I gave earlier on, where effectively the local authority is enabling something to happen. To the other end of the spectrum, where the local authority might completely insource the entirety of the project. But I would say, on balance, we sit somewhere in the middle, probably, and helping the public sector to plan and deploy these networks with the skills and experience that we've got in the private sector. And I would say particularly that investor operator experience is really important. So businesses that have invested in and are operating existing networks and understand what needs to be done effectively to make tariffs as low as possible and networks as efficient as possible is really key. So final slide, please. And if you can just click through. I suppose just to paint a very simplistic and high-level picture of potentially what that can look like. Effectively, what you've got here is the control room, I suppose, of the project, sitting with the public and private sector in a partnership type arrangement, and that's where you keep control of the things you need to keep control of effectively to make the project happen. It's where the investment can flow through. It's where the growth and the expansion resource can come from, to once you've got that core network deployed, to expand and grow and bring in as many new customers as possible. And then below that, there are obviously a series of services that will be needed to realise the ultimate ambition for the project, and they can be outsourced by the partnership, so that you've got some guarantees of value for money for the services that you're seeking there. And you can go obviously to the specialists in all those various fields to provide those services. So your top table partner may be able to provide some of those services, but equally, you know, from SSE's point of view, we would be happy to go to the market and bring in a partner for those things that are that suit the partnerships ambitions best of all. So yeah, just concluding, very conscious of time, apologies, but I think it's hopefully that's been useful in terms of where Ireland is in its journey. I think this is genuinely a really exciting time for district heating. I think we need to focus on those potential ownership and delivery models. I think the more examples we can get of these working in reality, the better. Trailblazing projects will be fantastic, and we've got work to do on the policy either side of you know, in Ireland and in the UK for sure, because we have to get the policy foundations right if we're going to see this this step change in the sector. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jody. And I think what we can all take away from that, we have, I suppose, an advantage, as Donna started out by saying, that we're starting here from scratch with a blank page in Ireland in the district energy industry, and we have the opportunity to learn from about 3 or 4 years of experience. We're 3 years into the Heat Network Investment Project in Britain, from what's gone well, what has not gone well, and the learnings which you've outlined there. And the enormous number of ingredients between expertise and good design, between appropriate policy and regulation and planning, and the number of stakeholders that have to be brought around the table to make a project a reality. So at this point, I'd like to thank all of our speakers. Donna, unfortunately, we've lost for technical reasons, and we're trying to get her back. So hopefully we'll be able to bring her back in to answer some of the questions which are addressed to her, to Guy, to Fiachra, and to Jody. And I'd like to hand over now to Giles Newton of SSE to moderate the question and answer and discussion session.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Dara. So we've had a few questions come in, a lot for Donna, so hopefully we can get her back. But one of the key themes that I'm picking up, which I'll start with you, Guy, is the role of gas in future DH network deployment. We've spoken today about integrating renewables and waste heat sources into district heat networks. But can you give us your experience and your viewpoints on what role gas has to play in the future?
Well, it obviously still has a role, certainly for any existing networks out there, and likely for, you know, the next years ahead to still have a role. Whether that's a leading role is less certain, but certainly a complementary role or a backup role, as Fiachra described earlier on. I mean, if I look at the networks that we are working on right now, there has been a huge shift in the last 12 months from clients not being prescriptive about the fuel source to becoming very prescriptive about low carbon, meeting low carbon objectives, and therefore you know, that's why, as I said in my presentation, we need to understand, well, where are those opportunities? There are a lot of cases in the UK now where local authorities don't like burning stuff, so they don't like bioenergy, biofuels, biomass, particularly, certainly in built-up areas. Energy from waste is controversial in some areas, although there's been quite a significant growth in most of the major cities in energy from waste plants in the last few years, largely I think driven by the ban on waste to landfill, and that presents an opportunity because, you know, there is a huge amount of surplus heat generated, as was highlighted by Jody in Leeds, and there are many other examples. We're working on a scheme on the outskirts of Edinburgh to take waste heat from a energy from waste plant. There are, I mean, if I look at examples of projects we in Ramboll have worked on recently, we've also worked on a sewage waste heat extraction scheme in Stirling, my home city. We're working on a low temperature version of that 4th gen scheme in Glasgow as well. We've taken heat from London Undergrounds. We worked on the scheme in Glasgow, the largest water source based heat pump district heating scheme in the UK right now. So there are opportunities there, and there are many opportunities in the continent where, you know, low carbon heat sources can and are being used. I think my last point, I think the big challenge remains is, you know, gas can and does provide, you know, high temperature heat, and unfortunately in the UK, and I suspect it's similar in Ireland, you know, the energy performance of buildings is generally not that great. Obviously it improves through time with building regs, but you know, we've got a lot of older buildings which are very leaky and very poor in terms of their energy performance and operate at high temperatures, and they need a high temperature heat supply to satisfy that need, and that is and has been delivered from gas or gas CHP based district heating schemes. So in order to transition away from that, a lot needs to be done and a lot of investment needs to be made to improve the energy performance of buildings. Now, most people would agree that that's a no regret option because it reduces demand, therefore it reduces consumer bills, but it does come at a cost. And if you look at a simple payback analysis, that's been hard to demonstrate. I think that's changing because we've seen a huge spike in gas prices, and it doesn't actually look like a spike anymore. It looks like high gas prices are here to stay now, and that obviously is helping to change the economic view in terms of the viability of gas and the viability of investing in reducing demand and improving the energy performance of buildings.
Great. No, thanks very much for that, Guy. That leads me on nicely to Jodie. In line with that, can you describe some of the challenges SSE have faced in decarbonising existing heat networks, and also the challenge with existing housing stock or building stock in the UK and Ireland, and the challenges with retrofitting district heat to those properties?
Sure. Yeah. So, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, in terms of existing networks, yeah, the portfolio we've got is predominantly gas CHP, gas boilers. So we've got projects on some of those networks now to retrofit centralized air source heat pump on one, potentially a water source solution on another. And yeah, there are multiple challenges. Absolutely. I mean, there are obviously technical and engineering challenges around the existing temperature of those networks, and reducing that to a point where you can effectively add your lower carbon technology, particularly if you've got, you know, an air source or a water source heat pump. There are challenges there, and obviously an impact on potentially on tertiary systems and on customer systems. Although there's lots of interesting work going on around that, and we think we can probably find a nice sweet spot effectively between the two, where we can minimize or have zero impact on customer tertiary systems and still keep decent efficiency with our heat generating plant at the energy centre. So there's probably a happy medium there. And sorry, what was the second part of the question, Giles, in terms of the retrofit of existing networks?
Exactly, the challenges with poor performing existing buildings and how you can connect district heat to those buildings. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I agree with Guy. You know, we've got to the two things have to go hand in hand. You know, the fabric of the building you're connecting to has got to be considered redesigned in line with your connection to the heat network, and obviously the temperature of that heat net will make a major difference. You know, the EFW based heat networks we're talking at will obviously run at higher temperatures than air source heat pump based networks, and so potentially the impact on buildings you're connecting to is less. Although there are still obviously very good economic reasons to address the fabric of that building as well. But I wouldn't, you know, where we're talking about wet systems and centralized plant rooms that you're connecting into, obviously you've got an easier engineering solution than if you're replacing something completely different. But we've taken out electric storage heaters in flats in Scotland and replaced them with new wet systems and new centralized heating systems. So it's all possible if it's planned and delivered in the whole. So you're designing the fabric and the network at the same time.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jodie. And Kevin, if I could turn to you and ask, listening to all the speakers today, what would be your key messages to government to increase the rollout of district heat in Ireland?
Wow, that's a big question, because
sorry,
there are a lot of barriers, as will be well known to everybody, I think. I suppose the starting point is the lens through which the business case is made from the point of view of decarbonising our society, and in that regard, it has to be to look at the issue in the same way as it would look at investing in any other piece of infrastructure. In other words, life cycle analysis. And it's a life cycle analysis that takes account of a realistic price for carbon, for CO2 emissions. But there's a gap between the business case as seen from a public policy point of view and as seen from the designer, builder, operator of the system and of the customer. And I mean, there are a lot of issues there. In fact, one of them is just following on the discussion we've just had. There could be a potential conflict between nearly zero energy buildings and net zero carbon or net carbon negative from the point of view of district heating, because the business case for district heating relies on having loads. If it takes 1,000 customers to make a scheme viable under regular conditions, when the average house demand, for example, was 20,000 kilowatt hours a year, and it's now under NZEB, it's 5,000 or 4,000 kilowatt hours per year. You've got a major increase in capex. You've got a lower density all round of heat demand, and I'm just putting that as a kind of a potential paradoxical challenge that government policy would need to address. And either way, to fill the gap between those two considerations, you really need to have interventionist policies, as far as whether it's some combination of regulation, financial, and developmental support for such developments. As I said, as a piece of infrastructure that's receptive to taking renewable energy in whatever form. So I think closing those two gaps, I think we need demonstration projects which can be supported through public funds, because in Ireland there's a lack of confidence in this whole area. It's not really true to say we have no experience. I'm aware of schemes of here, okay, they're fired by gas, but they would have been originally intended to be fired by biomass, which have been mothballed. And we had schemes built back from the 40s when they were fired by turf and coal, which were decommissioned from the 1980s onwards in our hospitals, and indeed we have a scheme currently in government buildings, which I understand is biomass, is designed for biomass. I'm not sure that it's running on biomass at the moment. So there's a general skepticism around this. So I think the way to address that would be by supporting, taking the initiative of supporting real demonstration projects. I believe that is happening. Donna can probably enlighten you more on that than I can. In relation to, she gave a presentation on this a few months back. But sorry about the length of my response. But as I said, there's the lens of public policy versus the lens of a commercial business case.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and thanks for your support in putting this webinar on. I'm conscious of time, and I appreciate that we have run over. Fiachra, if I could turn to you for a final question on your fascinating presentation, and that's around the technology that you installed and designed for the greenhouse project that you spoke about. Could you tell us whether that was technology readily available on the market, or was this a very bespoke engineering solution? And what kind of access does that give to other people trying to develop waste heat projects?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a combination of both. The engineering idea and to abstract heat from a wastewater treatment facility plant was a bespoke idea, never been attempted before, but what was readily available as off the market, if you will, heat pumps being available to be supplied as and when required was basically, they were readily available. Once they got foresight on the temperature profiles on what the final effluent was actually working to, we quickly found that they had a heat pump that could supply the required demand that was necessary for the end user. So I hope that, like looking at the combined heat and power process plant itself, that was a containerized off-the-shelf unit as well. I mean, they've been around the block now for quite some time. The gas boilers took a bit of digging to get our hands on those. They were supplied by a company in the Netherlands. But that was just solely down to the sheer capacity of them. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst accessing waste heat from sewage treatment processes is an expanding industry, it's interesting to hear that the heat pumps involved, the gas boilers, and indeed the CHP plant is all technology that is available and that people shouldn't be scared of using. So I think we've probably come to the end of our webinar, and I apologise for running over a short while, but I think to echo what everyone has said, it's a really exciting time for district heating in Ireland. There's been a huge statement of intent by government, the Climate Action Plan. We as SSE and ESB are excited about the potential for developing district heat in Ireland, and we're looking to government for clarity on the final 4 points around bringing in regulation and policy to support rollout of district heat. So thank you everyone for joining. I can see some questions have remained unanswered, and we will happily try and get to those via email response or chat on the Teams after this webinar. So thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.